So imagine if every government dollar spent on procurement could have a direct impact on underserved communities. Every year, governments spend upwards of 10% of their GDP procuring goods and services. In Brazil, the PNAE program switched from procuring food from large industrial multinationals to buying from local farmers. The impacts were obvious. With local farmers engaged in the supply chain, rural economies were uplifted and the nutritional quality of food being procured increased, greatly benefiting communities at both ends of the supply chain. Good morning, everyone. Today, we are presenting on the topic of social public procurement, specifically how to use public procurement to enable social enterprises and derive social value. For brevity, we will be using the acronym SPP to mean social public procurement. So my name is Tasha, and this is Annabel, Katherine, and Julia. And the presentation that you are hearing today is a modified version of one that we have prepared for our client, the SELCO Foundation in India, for them to share with their external stakeholders. These stakeholders are very diverse, ranging from governments to fellow NGOs, likely all within India. SELCO's mission is to alleviate poverty and fight climate change through decentralized, renewable, energy-driven solutions. They routinely work with social enterprises and are interested in how SPP can advance this work. Because of their relationship with governments and various government agencies, they're in a good position to advocate for and enable SPP. We will start by explaining what SPP is, why procurement should engage social enterprises, and the significance of SPP in India. Then we will discuss the enabling ecosystems required to achieve this engagement, which we have framed as good practices. I will now hand it over to Annabel to explain SPP.
So, what is SPP and how is it different from standard public procurement? Let me explain with an example. When the Ministry of Finance needs new desks for their office building, they create a tender. Businesses then bid on the tender to supply office desks, disclosing what they can provide and their price. The Ministry of Finance then selects the business with the best offer and awards the contract for office desks to that company. This is where SPP differs from standard procurement. In standard public procurement, bids are only evaluated on price and experience of the supplier. In social public procurement, the government is using its buying power to generate social value above and beyond the value of the goods or services being procured. In our example, the Ministry of Finance not only looks at the price and experience of the office desk suppliers, but also whether the desks are made under fair working conditions, use sustainable materials, and if the supplier reinvests in their community. I will now hand it over to Katherine to talk about why SPP should engage social enterprises.
Public procurement has traditionally favored large enterprises over small ones due to economies of scale. Therefore, traditional public procurement misses out on the social value that is derived from engaging with small, local, or social enterprises. For example, when the Odisha state government began collaborating with the Odisha Millets Mission, they were able to procure food for the government food programs in ways that support small-scale farmers, women's self-help groups, ecologically friendly indigenous-led land practices, and the economy of the local region. So doing that rather than buying industrial produced food products, which would result in having fewer tertiary benefits. Engaging social enterprises in public procurement results in profits being reinvested back into the local economy or towards the mission of the social enterprise. Moving on to what this means for the potential for India. SPP practices are emerging globally to help achieve social, environmental, and financial sustainability. SPP adoption has been increasing globally as effective government policy has the greatest potential to grow the social enterprise movement and help transition the world to a global impact economy. Because India spends 30% of its GDP on public procurement, it's in a great position to advance the SDGs through SPP. SPP practices in India have not yet realized their full potential in engaging social enterprises to respond to community needs and progress towards achieving the SDGs. I will now hand it over to Julia to discuss our research methods.
Great. So in order to better understand the global SPP landscape, 4 different case study countries were analyzed, and these were Brazil, Malaysia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. And these case studies were selected due to their high public procurement spending, potential ecosystem similarities to India, or existing SPP practices. And then 15 interviews were conducted with a variety of SPP professionals. And naming the findings good practices was intentional because the term best practices may suggest the existence of universal solutions to complex and context-specific challenges. And I'll now hand it over to Annabel to take you through our first good practice, SPP championship.
Individual government workers are part of what we call SPP champions. These government workers are crucial to making a change by advocating for a particular idea, such as SPP. These champions within government are able to influence those above them to adopt their champion cause, invest resources in it, and implement it in an effective manner. All of our interviewees emphasize the essential role that top managers, middle managers, and entry-level workers inside the government play to advance SPP. We call this idea of SPP champions at all levels the advocacy sandwich. Organizations who want to implement change have to identify the right person within the relevant government department who has enough influence. According to an interview with social enterprise innovator Shantanu Paul, he has consistently seen that working with SPP champions from the government is the best and easiest way to go about change. Julia will now take you through our second good practice, intermediaries.
Great. So the second good practice we determined is the emergence of intermediary organizations to support social enterprises. So the prominence of intermediaries is quickly growing in India, helping to promote social entrepreneurship in the pursuit of specific social outcomes. And in doing so, their main role has largely been focused around 3 areas. And these are network building, advocacy, and connecting social enterprises to SPP. So for the first role of network building, India now has many active forums where the social enterprise community can come together to network, engage, and discuss with other stakeholders, allowing organizations to share updates, opportunities, and challenges across sectors and locations. And by providing these opportunities, intermediaries are helping social enterprises to become more engaged in business activities by providing them with a centralized forum for discussion and learning with other social entrepreneurs. And now the second role of intermediaries is acting as advocates. So intermediaries have proven to hold great potential in actually influencing SPP policy. So for example, in the United Kingdom, an intermediary called Social Enterprise UK was instrumental in the passing of what's known as the social value model, which is now a national SPP policy in the UK. And this requires that every public procurement bid weigh 10% of its score on the social value of the proposal. And ultimately, this did help to spark a widespread commitment to SPP in the UK by leveling the playing field for social enterprises who were otherwise left out of procurement bids beforehand. And finally, the most important role played by intermediaries is connecting social enterprises to SPP, which is where the largest gap currently exists in India. So social enterprises are characteristically smaller businesses, meaning that they do not always have the capacity to take on the procurement process themselves. So by directly connecting social enterprises with buyers for procurement tenders, it helps to remove a lot of the bureaucratic liabilities that are actually placed on social enterprises in the procurement process, and they provide them with additional resources to help them navigate contracts. So for example, in New Zealand, the procurement process can be quite prescriptive and lengthy. So extensive time and resources are required from the supplier side to comb through buyer requirements. And this is where an intermediary called Amotai works to bridge the gap between social enterprises and procurement bids, particularly for Maori enterprises. And in smaller businesses, time and resources are more limited and cannot always be put towards having an explicit role for tendering, making it less likely that social enterprises will become involved in the procurement process at all. So this is where Amotai becomes involved to help connect the businesses directly with the buyers, helping to remove a lot of the fundamental barriers that come along with the procurement process. And now I'll pass it over to Katherine to take you through our third good practice, legislation.
The existence of relevant public procurement legislation has emerged as a significant component for successful SPP adoption. SPP legislation, put simply, is progressive public procurement policy. SPP does not exist in a separate rulebook from regular public procurement. It involves updating the systems and guidelines to focus on social impact. However, our case studies did highlight an important lesson, which is SPP policy change happens gradually. For example, in Malaysia, the government introduced in 2021 the Social Impact Procurement Program as an initiative to promote SPP across the Malaysian government. As a proof of concept pilot project, the government launched this program in 5 ministries. An interview with a Malaysian government agency manager highlighted that this program should be seen as a long-term investment, constantly growing and being updated. India's public procurement ecosystem does not include comprehensive central legislation. Primarily, public procurement in India must adhere to the general financial rules, the Manual on Procurement of Goods, and other ministry or state-specific public procurement rules. That being said, India has implemented procurement policies that could allow SPP to be gradually adopted and grow. I'll now hand it over to Tasha to discuss our next steps.
So these next steps act upon the good practices identified in our research to direct SELCO in their efforts to advance SPP. The first step is to identify and encourage SPP champions within government. It is important to locate the right people who can leverage their position to incorporate SPP. According to our research, individuals tend to fulfill multiple important roles and perform work above and beyond their prescribed responsibilities in order to advance innovative practices. Supporting them with information and resources is crucial. The second way to advance SPP is to establish intermediary organizations to perform the roles of networking, advocacy, and connecting social enterprises to government tenders. At present, these 3 roles are performed separately by different organizations in India. By designating one intermediary organization to fulfill all 3 roles, a more supportive and intuitive process can be created that removes some of the fundamental barriers and helps social enterprises to become more involved in procurement. A third way to advance SPP is to identify targeted and feasible policy amendments. Small changes in procurement policy and legislation can go a long way, as evidenced by the social value model in the UK. Introducing policy changes that gradually increase requirements towards incorporating social value in public procurement tenders increases the opportunity for social enterprises to win bids because social impact is inherent to their operations. For example, amending the Indian public policy procurement policy for micro and small enterprises order would be a great place to start. This policy asks departments to consider micro and small enterprises and sets targets for specific caste, Indigenous, and women-owned businesses. This policy could be expanded to include enterprises with other social impact objectives as well. So in conclusion, the public procurement landscape is evolving. Large buying power means opportunity for social responsibility. And by incorporating social value into the supply chain, procurement offices have the potential to affect change in the very sectors or communities where government support is needed, funding progress towards the SDGs. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and we now invite your questions.
Well done, team. What a great start to the day. Thanks so much. Of course, as with all the presentations, we'll turn to the client first to hear some comments and questions. Are we getting a picture on Zoom of people logged in? Still working on that, but I'm assuming that Zoomland can hear us. So I'd like to turn to the SELCO Foundation and specifically to Ms. Shurabi Rajapulgal for some comments and questions if you have them. Yes, let's give it a moment till we get this figured out. Matthias Margulis, our colleague from the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, has been the faculty working with the team, of course, all year long. And so, Matthias, some questions.
Excellent presentation. So it's been interesting to see this project evolve from the beginning. I wrote about 10 months ago. I sent you some readings on SPP. It's brand new. Now you're here. 9 months later, as experts, you've had this global view of SPP through this project. And I just wanted to maybe ask you and try to think about, bring it back to the local or the Canadian context. Think about what you've learned through this process. As you mentioned, SPP is scaling up around the world. Clearly, Canada was not one of those leader case studies, so clearly we're not there. I'm just wondering, given everything you've learned, could you tell us maybe what your instincts would be of where SPP could potentially grow in Canada? Are there things that we could learn from the global view that you've gathered here that we could adopt here in Canada to advance SPP?
Thank you for that question, Matthias. I think Katherine will take a stab at that question.
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly start off by saying Canada actually is doing a lot of really great stuff when it comes to SPP. It was very difficult to choose case studies. We ended up going with countries that our client was also interested in. And so it started by, I think, pulling together more than 15 countries that had interesting SPP practices that we would like to dive into. But Canada has some things that they're doing. I think last year we just passed some SPP legislation, and there's some great intermediary organizations like Bisocial Canada that operate, just out of Vancouver here as well. In terms of applicable steps and processes that we've learned from this global view, I think it was best said in an interview that we completed in New Zealand. It was a research paper that said SPP is like, they use the term bricolage. It's like a collage, it's a mix, it's a puzzle. You need all these different components to make it work. And so I think our project was trying to figure out what those specific components were, and that's where our good practices came from. So I think to highlight a few, there needs to be legislation or policy enforcing this. It is no one, especially in government, plates are full, jobs are already difficult. Coming in and saying, I think it'd be so fun if we made your job harder, is that usually doesn't go over well. So having reinforcement and accountability measures is really key. But to get to that point, to change the way public procurement is done, you need these advocates, and those advocates need support systems, and those are the intermediaries. So I would just say it's a mix, it's a balance, and it is coming from both private and public sectors pushing for this change. Thank you.
Great, Katherine, fantastic. Let's hear from SELCO then.
Hi, am I audible? Hi, this is Surbi here from SELCO Foundation. Thank you so much. We had a bit of an issue with the link, but I think we're familiar with the team's work, and they've been great in sort of keeping us updated and keeping us in the loop on how it's going. I think, because we've addressed a lot of the questions that we've had around the specific aspects of social procurement through a lot of the conversations. So I think just a slightly higher level question around, the kind of aspects that we're talking about. How do you see that play out while looking at also coursework, and can aspects of public policy coursework look more seriously at social procurement and enable greater understanding of that? And yeah, any thoughts you have on that? I know that that's not directly linked to the procurement piece that you've been working on, but maybe just reflections from what you've looked at.
Thank you so much, Surabhi, for that question. I'm happy to answer it in a general way. So I think, first of all, what we realized is that social public procurement is part of like a larger process, right? We connected it very strongly towards working towards the SDGs, for example. It is basically, in our mind, the governments, when they, in their purchasing, in the government's own purchasing, it is their way of addressing, a lot of issues across the board, right? And then, of course, on the other hand, what Katherine mentioned in her legislation part,
Sorry, I can't hear anything.
Just walk towards the room, right?
so
Yeah,
social, okay. Social public procurement is really just, let's say, a word for, more like advancing public procurement as a whole, right? Towards addressing, let's say, poverty, addressing climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So great idea of including social public procurement in, in a curriculum, especially for this program. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think there's a lot of ties, right, of all these topics that we're already addressing in school. But yeah, it could certainly, be highlighted more, public procurement as well as social public procurement more specifically.
Great. Surabhi, another question or comment you want to offer?
Nothing else from my end. I think just to say that, I think, it was a new area for us to be exploring as well as SELCO Foundation. So I think it was really valuable to bring those insights from the different country examples, and we really appreciated the effort. And as Annabel put it, I think it's really good to kind of integrate it in our thinking around SDGs itself and government action. So I think that's a great way to think about it. Thanks.
Fantastic, great to hear. We have a little bit of time for questions.
I have a couple in the.
Okay, we've got some questions online, and you will facilitate that somehow,
I will. So the first one is from Tara. First of all, they say, great presentation. The point about finding government champions for policy or procurement change makes a lot of sense. I'm curious about whether different tactics are needed to find and nurture these relationships, depending on whether it's a more powerful but harder to reach top manager or less influential but easier to reach entry-level staff person.
Thank you for the question, Tara. I think, the reason why we came up with this advocacy sandwich is because, we have this great quote that you really need from an interview from somebody in New Zealand. working with social enterprises, that you need champions at all levels, right? So you really, it's, yes, you need to identify a person, interested in advocating for implementing SPP at all, like, at the top, like in a top management position, in a middle management position, and like an entry level position. But it's not enough if there's only one. It's just really about identifying, the person in each who, and then also they, these people themselves need to know, okay, well, who can I talk to further up to, to take on or take up this issue? Who do I have a good relationship with? Who might be interested, in similar topics, and all of that.
Awesome. So the next question is from Shannon. This is an excellent presentation. Thank you so much. I have no questions, just to say that I agree. Oh, maybe I should have read ahead, but they just said, I would just have to say that I want to agree with you that from an intersectional and GBA plus perspective, adoption of SPP policy has disproportionately positive effect on women and other groups who may be economically marginalized. The size of procurement bids might be an issue and daunting without assistance as of advocates, as you say. So maybe I should ask the actual question, again, more so a comment. So Mark, you have the next question, right? Oh dear.
I had a question in terms of the case studies you looked at, if you found anything around how like social impact or success was measured, and because, knowing how governments like numbers, and, how to actually see the impact of their work, I wonder if you saw any sort of frameworks or approaches for evaluation.
Yeah, thanks for your question, David. So an example of an evaluation model is with the social value model in the UK that we mentioned during our presentation. So they've got 5 criteria set out to actually measure how that 10% weight of the procurement proposals will actually impact the community. So try to recall every single one of them here, but one of them is more recent for COVID-19 recovery. Then there is health and wellness, employment equity. Ooh, the other 2 are escaping me, but they're along those lines. And so they use that 10% of each procurement bid essentially to see how exactly it fits into each of those categories and how they can impact the community through these avenues.
Just a, very quick addition to your question, because I think we should also plug our report is more substantial than the presentation that we've given today. We'd love everyone to read it. And one of our good practices does come down to data and e-procurement, because it is so crucial. The program we've all just done for the last 2 years has highlighted, if anything else, evidence-based policymaking. And it's really crucial for SPP and to prove that this is an option that government should pursue. So that data collection has been a key challenge for a lot of the case studies that we did look at. That's where intermediaries come into play, collecting impact data from the social enterprises that they work with who are successful in attaining those procurement bids. And also a lot of the e-procurement systems have been really influential in this as well, having that online data and being able to update criteria and see where that goes. Yeah, just wanted to quickly add that.
I see from the distance in Zoom, just comments. Good, yeah, Art, you go.
First of all, excellent presentation. You guys set the bar very high for the beginning of the day, so well done. I'm wondering, I'd imagine when I think of people getting government contracts or companies getting government contracts, especially in the US context, it's a highly sort of political situation. And I think I was just basically wondering if you found strategies for sort of dealing with the entrenched sort of power of these really large suppliers who are able to offer that economy of scale, and maybe also have connections with people who are making those purchasing, decisions in the first place.
Thank you, Art, for that question. I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is transparency, right? One way we highlighted transparency to achieve transparency in our report is through e-procurement. So the government of India in 2020 announced like a new platform for e-procurement that would really unify all the previous platforms into one. It's called the Unified Procurement System. So, and they would have like standardized documents. All of that is important for transparency. It's also important for smaller businesses like social enterprises, right? Because the more standardized a process is, as hard as it still is, it is easier for smaller businesses than to apply for these government contracts. I'll leave it at that, yeah.
An SDG pin, is that just for the session this morning, or?
No, that is an SDG pin.
Oh, very good.
Should I have the microphone, or maybe?
My room light's on, it's on.
The room light's on, fine. A quick comment and then a question. The comment is actually, as it happens, just yesterday, I received an invitation to submit a tender to the Government of Canada through Environment and Climate Change Canada, and they have specified that the bids will be judged on 70% on content and 30% on price. And I'm sitting here thinking, Jesus, I wish they had brought in an SPP approach, because as a university bidder, that would definitely be an advantage to us and involving students in the bid. Anyhow, that's the comment. The question is a bit more speculative, but you're working in the procurement world, and you'd be talking to people who are government procurement specialists, and that's a whole subculture within government. But the SPP thinking reminds me a lot, and no doubt there's some crossover. I'm just wondering if you encountered any crossover in the investment world coming up with ESG guidelines, environment, social, and governance guidelines for investment practices. And is there some space where encouraging governments to think more about including the social component in procurement might also be reflected in encouraging companies to think about how to start factoring similar social benefits in their investment and risk management guidelines?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think quite honestly, it's a little outside the scope of our project. Where we did see some crossover was around CSR more generally, because there is a lot more conversations happening to try to encourage CSR practices, but also accountability measures for that as well. So I think that's where we saw some crossover. Language in general was a difficult part of this project. That sounds quite simple. Social public procurement can also, some people call it sustainable public procurement, green public procurement. Many countries don't have definitions for what a social enterprise is. When you start to define something, you essentially will exclude people when you're doing that. And when this is about social impact, excluding anyone is against the inherent purpose of SPP. And that's where I think there are some difficulties with CSR, because I think there are challenges with CSR sometimes being greenwashing or organizations not being held accountable. But as we said before, this needs to be an effort on both private and public. Apologies, I was skirting around your question, but I hope that helps.